March 6, 1914. George Vanderbilt woke up in a Washington, D.C. hospital room feeling worse than he had the day before. He was 51 years old, recovering from what should have been routine surgery, an appendectomy. Doctors had assured him the procedure was safe, the recovery straightforward. But something had gone wrong. His fever was rising. The pain was spreading. By nightfall, he would be dead. 300 miles south in Asheville, North Carolina, stood Biltmore Estate. 250 rooms, 178,000 square feet, the largest private home ever built in America. George had spent 6 years constructing it, pouring millions into creating a French chateau in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He had filled it with priceless art, rare books, furniture shipped from Europe. He had assembled 125,000 acres of forest and farmland around it. He had created an American palace that rivaled anything the old world could offer, and in a few hours, it would all belong to his widow. Edith Vanderbilt was 42 years old with a 14-year-old daughter. She had no business training, no legal expertise, no understanding of what was about to hit her. George's sudden death would trigger a financial crisis that would nearly destroy everything he had built. Because in October of 1913, just months before George died, the United States government had passed a brand new law, the federal estate tax, and the Vanderbilts were about to become its most famous victims. Edith would spend the next 15 years fighting the government for the right to keep her own home. She would lose 90% of the estate George had created. 87,000 acres sold, artwork auctioned, furniture scattered. The lawyers would take years. The costs would be crushing. And even after she won, she would discover that winning wasn't enough. The Great Depression would force one final surrender that George would have considered unthinkable. This is the story of how the IRS nearly took Biltmore, how one widow fought the federal government and lost almost everything to keep the house, and how she saved it in the end by doing the one thing her husband never would have allowed. She opened the doors and let strangers in. If you enjoy stories about the cost of preserving history, hit that like button and subscribe. Let's begin with the telegram that changed everything. Chapter 1. March 6, 1914. The day everything fell apart. George Washington Vanderbilt was born into American aristocracy on November 14, 1862. He was the youngest grandson of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, the railroad baron who had built one of the largest fortunes in American history. While his older brothers fought over the family businesses, the youngest son preferred books. He collected rare volumes, studied architecture, traveled through Europe absorbing culture and refinement. He was shy, intellectual, more comfortable in libraries than boardrooms. When his father, William Henry Vanderbilt, died in 1885, the scholarly son inherited approximately $10 million. It was a fraction of what his older brothers received, but it was enough. He didn't want to run railroads or expand empires. He wanted to build something beautiful, something permanent, something that proved American wealth could create art as magnificent as anything Europe offered. He chose Asheville, North Carolina, a small mountain town with cool summers and spectacular views, and he began buying land. By 1889, he owned 125,000 acres of Blue Ridge Mountains forest and farmland. He commissioned Richard Morris Hunt, America's greatest architect, to design a chateau modeled on the French Renaissance palaces of the Loire Valley. Construction began that same year and continued for 6 years. Over 1,000 workers labored to create 250 rooms filled with every luxury imaginable, a 70-foot-high banquet hall, a library with 10,000 rare books, an indoor pool, a bowling alley, central heating, electric lights, refrigeration technology, and craftsmanship combined to create the largest private residence in America. The owner moved into Biltmore on Christmas Eve, 1895. He was 33 years old, unmarried, master of a palace that cost over $6 million to build. For 3 years he lived there alone, hosting occasional guests, managing his forests, playing the role of country gentleman. Then, in 1898, he married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in Paris. She was 25, from a prominent Rhode Island family, cultured, and intelligent. The shy collector had finally found someone who understood what he was trying to create. Their daughter Cornelia was born at Biltmore in August of 1900. The father was 37, his wife 27. They had wealth, a magnificent home. A growing family days were spent managing forestry operations with Gifford Pinchot, America's first professional forester. The art collection expanded, additions made to the library, every detail refined. The builder had created exactly the life he wanted. Quiet, cultured, removed from the brutal business world his brothers inhabited. By March of 1914, the couple had been married 16 years. Cornelia was 13, being educated by private tutors. The family divided their time between the mountain retreat and their Washington, D.C. townhouse. The patriarch was 51 years old, in apparently good health, with no reason to expect anything but decades more of the refined country life he had built. Then his appendix began to hurt. It was a common enough problem, usually not serious if caught early. Doctors in Washington recommended surgery. An appendectomy was routine by those standards. Thousands were performed annually. The risks were minimal if done properly. The patient checked into a hospital and prepared for what should have been a minor procedure. The surgery took place in early March. Initially, everything seemed fine. Recovery proceeded in his hospital room with expectations of returning to Asheville within a week or two, but complications developed. The specific details were never made entirely public, but something had failed during or after the operation infection, perhaps. Internal bleeding? Medical error? In that era, even routine surgeries carried risks that modern medicine has eliminated. His condition deteriorated rapidly. The fever spiked. The pain increased. Doctors tried everything available to them, but their tools were limited. Antibiotics wouldn't be discovered for another 15 years. Surgical techniques were improving, but still crude by modern standards. Whatever had gone awry, they couldn't fix it. On March 6, 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt died in his Washington hospital room. He was 51 years old. The official cause was listed as complications from appendectomy surgery. His body was returned to Asheville and buried in the family plot. Hundreds attended the funeral. Newspapers across America reported the loss. The man who had built America's largest private home was gone, leaving behind a widow, a teenage daughter, and property whose value no one had yet calculated. Edith received the news by telegram. She was 42 years old, suddenly alone with responsibilities she didn't fully understand. Her husband had managed everything during their marriage: the finances, the legal matters, the business operations. She had focused on Cornelia's education, the social aspects of running their home, the household management. She knew the property was valuable. She knew it cost money to maintain. But she had no idea what was coming. Her husband's will was straightforward. Everything went to the widow: the chateau, the land, the art collection, the furniture, the library. 125,000 acres of North Carolina mountains. The mansion with its 250 rooms. Every painting, every book, every tapestry and chandelier, she inherited it all. And with it, she inherited a problem that would nearly destroy her. Because just 5 months before the death, the federal government had passed a brand new law: the estate tax. Wealthy Americans who died after October of 1913 would have their holdings assessed and taxed before heirs could inherit. The rates ranged from 1% to 10% depending on size. For someone with millions in property and assets, the tax bill would be substantial, and the widow would have to pay it before she could legally claim her inheritance. She didn't understand this yet. In the immediate aftermath, she was focused on grief, on Cornelia, on funeral arrangements. The lawyers would explain the tax situation soon enough. The IRS assessors would arrive within months, and she would discover that owning America's largest private residence meant facing America's newest and most aggressive tax collectors. The battle for Biltmore was about to begin. Chapter 2: The Richest Widow in America and the Poorest. The lawyers gathered in the library at Biltmore 3 weeks after the funeral. Edith sat across from them, listening as they explained what she had inherited: The news should have been comforting. On paper, she was one of the wealthiest women in America. In reality, she was nearly broke. The land alone was valued at several $1,000,000. 125,000 acres of North Carolina mountains, most of it virgin timber. The house and its contents represented at least another $2 million. Paintings by Renoir and Whistler, tapestries from the 16th century furniture purchased from French chateaux. The library contained 10,000 rare books, some worth thousands each. Every room held treasures that museums would envy. Total estimated value of the inheritance, somewhere between $5 and $10 million. The lawyers couldn't be more specific because much of it had never been formally appraised. How do you price a chateau that no one else in America owns? What's a fair market value for property so unique that comparable sales don't exist? But here was the problem. Almost none of it was liquid. Edith couldn't pay bills with tapestries. She couldn't write checks against the value of virgin timber. The wealth was real, but it was locked in assets that would take months or years to convert to cash. And she had immediate expenses that demanded actual money. The annual operating budget for Biltmore ran approximately $50,000. That covered the most basic necessities. 80 servants on payroll, from the butler down to the scullery maids, each required wages, housing, food. The estate's massive boilers consumed coal by the ton to heat 250 rooms. The electric plant needed fuel. The farms required seed and equipment. Maintenance was constant. Roofs leaked, pipes burst, paint faded. A structure this size deteriorated faster than most people could imagine. Then there were the property taxes. North Carolina assessed the land and buildings annually. The exact amount varied, but it was substantial. Add insurance premiums for a property worth millions. Add upkeep on the forest and farms. Add food costs for family and staff. The number kept climbing. Edith had perhaps $100,000 in liquid assets. Bank accounts, bonds that could be sold quickly, cash reserves her late husband had maintained. It sounds like plenty until you realize it represented less than 2 years of operating expenses. After that, she would need to start selling. And once she started selling, she might not be able to stop. The lawyers explained another problem. Under her husband's will, she inherited everything. But everything included debts and obligations. Any money owed at the time of death became her responsibility. Construction projects underway had to be completed or canceled. With penalties either way, contracts signed required fulfillment. Every financial commitment made transferred to the widow. Worse, the inheritance wasn't technically hers yet. Not until the estate was settled. That process would take months at minimum, possibly years. During that time, she had to maintain the property using her own limited resources. The courts wouldn't release the full inheritance until all taxes were paid, all debts settled, all legal requirements met. She was cash poor while owning millions in assets she couldn't yet touch. 14-year-old Cornelia sat upstairs, being educated by tutors who expected their salaries on schedule. The kitchen staff prepared meals for a household of nearly 100 people. The gardeners maintained grounds that sprawled across acres. The foresters managed timber operations that required oversight. Every single day, Biltmore consumed money. And every day, Edith's liquid reserves shrank a little more. She had no business training. Her education had prepared her for society, for managing a household, for raising a daughter in cultured surroundings. She could speak French fluently, discuss art intelligently, host a dinner party for 30 with flawless execution. But she had never managed a payroll. She had never negotiated with timber buyers or dealt with tax assessors. Those had been her husband's domain. The staff looked to her now for decisions. The foresters needed approvals for which trees to cut. The farm managers wanted guidance on crop planning. The butler required instruction on household operations. Everyone assumed she knew what she was doing. She didn't. She was learning as fast as possible, reading her husband's papers, consulting with his former advisors, trying to understand businesses she had barely known existed. The lawyers raised another concern. The federal government would soon send assessors to value the property for tax purposes. This was because of that new law passed 5 months before the death, the estate tax. Rates ranged up to 10% on the largest inheritances. For someone inheriting $5 to $10 million worth of property, the tax bill could reach $500,000 or more. $500,000 in cash, due within months of the assessment. Edith had $100,000 in liquid assets. Where would she find the other $400,000? The only answer was to sell. Timber, perhaps. Or land. Maybe some of the art collection, though selling masterworks would take time and wouldn't fetch full value in a hurried sale. She was being forced to dismantle her husband's creation before she had even finished grieving his loss. The widow asked the obvious question: could she simply give it back? Refuse the inheritance, walk away, let someone else deal with this impossible situation? The lawyers shook their heads. She had a 14-year-old daughter to support. Cornelia would inherit eventually. Walking away now would leave the girl with nothing. Besides, where would they live? What would they do? Society women of their class didn't work. They didn't have careers. They managed households, raised families, lived on inherited wealth. Edith's entire life had been built around being Mrs. George Vanderbilt. That identity didn't work if she surrendered everything that came with the name. So she would fight. She had no choice. But she also had no illusions. The inheritance that made her wealthy on paper was about to force her into desperate financial decisions. The largest private home in America was becoming the most expensive burden in the country. And the woman who owned it was about to discover that sometimes the greatest wealth is also the greatest trap. The lawyers left that evening with instructions. Prepare for the tax assessment. Begin identifying which assets could be sold most quickly if necessary. Find buyers for timber that could be harvested immediately. And pray that the federal assessors valued the property conservatively. Because if they decided Biltmore was worth more than expected, the resulting tax bill might force Edith to sell the house itself just to pay for the privilege of inheriting it. She sat in the library after they departed, surrounded by 10,000 books her husband had spent decades collecting. Outside the windows, 125,000 acres of mountains stretched into the distance. Upstairs, her daughter slept in a bedroom larger than most people's homes, and in her bank account she had barely enough money to keep it all running for 2 more years. The richest widow in America was also the poorest, and her problems were just beginning. Chapter 3. The New Tax That Changed Everything. The 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified on February 3, 1913. It consisted of one sentence: "The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes, from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration." That single sentence changed American history, and it would change Edith Vanderbilt's life. For over a century, the federal government had funded itself primarily through tariffs and excise taxes. Direct taxation of individual income was unconstitutional. The wealthy paid relatively little in federal taxes because their wealth came from investments, not wages. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, the Vanderbilts, all the great fortunes of the Gilded Age had grown largely untouched by federal taxation. States and cities collected property taxes. The federal government mostly didn't. But progressive reformers had been pushing for change since the 1890s. They argued that concentrated wealth threatened democracy, that industrial fortunes had grown too large, that the gap between rich and poor was destabilizing society. The solution, they believed, was taxation, tax income, tax estates. Force the wealthy to contribute more to the government that protected their property, and maintain the infrastructure that made their businesses possible. The amendment passed Congress in 1912 and was ratified by the required number of states in early 1913. For the first time in American history, the federal government could tax income directly. Congress acted quickly. In October of 1913, they passed the Revenue Act. It established a graduated income tax, starting at 1% on income over $3,000 and rising to 7% on income over $500,000. The wealthy would finally pay their share. Buried in the same legislation was another provision, the estate tax. When a wealthy American died, their estate would be assessed and taxed before the heirs could inherit. The rate started at 1% on estates worth over $50,000 and climbed to a maximum of 10% on estates exceeding $500,000. It wasn't particularly aggressive by later standards. But it was revolutionary in 1913 because it had never existed before. The timing was catastrophic for the Vanderbilt family. The law passed in October of 1913. George Vanderbilt died in March of 1914. 5 months. If he had died 6 months earlier, his entire estate would have passed to Edith tax-free. The federal government wouldn't have touched it. Instead, he died just after the new law took effect, making his widow one of the first victims of America's brand new estate tax system. The law was deliberately designed to target exactly the kind of wealth George had accumulated: large estates, property holdings, art collections, timberland, everything that defined Gilded Age fortunes. The progressives who wrote the legislation wanted to prevent the creation of permanent American aristocracy. They believed inherited wealth concentrated too much power in too few families. The estate tax would force each generation to pay for the privilege of inheriting what their parents had built. For middle-class Americans, the tax was irrelevant. An estate worth $50,000 or less passed tax-free. That covered the vast majority of the population. Even moderately wealthy families with estates worth $100,000 or $200,000 faced tax bills of only a few $1,000s, manageable. Not pleasant, but not devastating. But for someone like Edith, inheriting several $1 million in property, the math became brutal. 10% of $5 million is $500,000 in cash, due within a year of the estate assessment. The government didn't care that the wealth was locked in land and buildings and art. They didn't care that converting assets to cash would take time and destroy value. The tax was calculated on total estate value, and payment was required in actual money. The law included no exceptions for unique properties. If you inherited a factory, you could sell it. Someone would buy a profitable business. If you inherited stocks and bonds, markets existed for those. But if you inherited the largest private house in America, located in rural North Carolina, with no comparable properties anywhere, who exactly would purchase it? The market for 250-room chateau was limited, essentially non-existent. This created a perverse situation. The property might be valued at millions for tax purposes, but it couldn't be sold for anything close to that amount. Edith would owe taxes based on a theoretical value that bore little relationship to what she could actually get if forced to sell. She would pay tax on wealth she couldn't access at prices no buyer would pay. The IRS understood this perfectly well. In fact, they counted on it. The estate tax was designed to break up large fortunes by forcing heirs to liquidate assets. If Edith had to sell 80,000 acres to pay the tax bill, that was exactly what the progressives wanted. Those acres would go to timber companies, farmers, developers. The concentration of wealth would diminish. The Vanderbilt holdings would shrink. Mission accomplished. From the government's perspective, this was good policy. It prevented dynastic wealth. It generated federal revenue. It promoted a more equal distribution of property. The fact that it destroyed what George had spent decades building was irrelevant. The law applied equally to everyone. If you couldn't afford to pay the tax on what you inherited, you sold enough to cover the bill simple. From Edith's perspective, it was confiscation disguised as taxation. Her husband had already paid taxes on the income that purchased the land. He had paid property taxes annually on what he owned. Now the government wanted another huge payment just for the privilege of passing that property to his widow. It felt like theft. But feelings didn't matter. The law was the law. The 16th Amendment was constitutional. The Revenue Act of 1913 had been properly passed by Congress and signed by President Wilson. The estate tax was legal, it was enforceable, and it was coming for Biltmore. Within months, federal assessors would arrive to value everything George had left behind. They would calculate the tax owed, and Edith would have to find a way to pay it or start selling the estate piece by piece until the bill was satisfied. She had no political power to fight the law itself. No court would overturn it. Her only hope was to fight the valuation. If the assessors decided Biltmore was worth $10 million, she was finished. The tax alone would exceed $500,000, more than 5 times her liquid assets. She would have to sell massive portions of the property immediately, but if she could convince them the value was lower, if she could argue that unique property should be assessed differently, if her lawyers could find any legal strategy to reduce the bill, she might survive. The battle was about to begin. The United States government versus one widow trying to keep her home. The richest country in the world had just invented a new way to tax wealth, and they were coming to Asheville to collect Edith Vanderbilt had buried her husband 5 months after the law passed. Now she would spend years fighting the bureaucrats who wanted to take what he had left her. The estate tax had changed everything. And it would nearly take everything too. Chapter 4. The IRS comes to Asheville. The assessors arrived in the summer of 1914, 4 months after the funeral. 3 men in dark suits carrying leather briefcases and clipboards stepped off the train in Asheville and hired a car to take them to Biltmore. They were federal agents from the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the agency that would later become the IRS. Their job was simple. Walk through every room, examine every asset, assign a dollar value to everything Edith had inherited, then calculate what she owed. They presented themselves at the main entrance and requested access to the property. Edith had been warned this was coming. Her lawyers had explained that she couldn't refuse. The law required cooperation with federal assessors. Blocking them would result in penalties and potentially criminal charges. So she instructed her butler to let them in and assigned staff to accompany them wherever they needed to go. The assessment would take weeks. The agents started with the house itself. They measured rooms, noted construction materials, evaluated the quality of finishes, the banquet hall with its 70-foot ceiling, the library with built-in shelving for 10,000 volumes, the indoor pool lined with tile, the bowling alley in the basement, the gymnasium. Every space had to be documented, measured, valued. They brought in specialists for certain items. An art appraiser examined the paintings: Renoir, Whistler, Sargent. Each canvas was photographed, authenticated, assigned a market value. The tapestries hanging in the halls received similar treatment: 16th century Flemish work, some of it museum quality. The appraiser consulted auction records, compared similar pieces sold recently, estimated what these would bring if Edith were forced to sell them. The furniture presented complications. Much of it had been purchased directly from French chateaux and Italian palaces. George had bought entire rooms, had them disassembled, shipped across the Atlantic, and reconstructed inside Biltmore. How do you value a Louis XV bedroom set that came from Versailles? What's the market price for Renaissance Revival pieces that no longer exist anywhere else? The appraisers did their best, assigning conservative estimates where provenance was clear and educated guesses where it wasn't. The library required days of work. 10,000 books, many of them rare first editions. The agents brought in a rare book dealer from New York who spent a week examining volumes, checking condition, researching values. A first edition of Don Quixote, medieval manuscripts, illuminated texts, signed presentation copies from famous authors. Each book was cataloged, valued, added to the growing total. Outside, different specialists assessed the land. 125,000 acres of North Carolina mountains. Most of it virgin timber, never logged. The forestry experts walked the property, estimated board feet of lumber per acre, calculated what the timber would bring at current market prices. They examined the farms, valued the agricultural land separately. They assessed water rights, mineral rights, road access. The process was invasive and humiliating. Strangers walked through Edith's bedroom, opening closets, examining personal possessions. They cataloged her jewelry, her clothing, items that had belonged to her husband. Nothing was private. Everything had value, and therefore everything had to be counted. Federal law required complete disclosure. Hiding assets was fraud, punishable by prison time. Cornelia watched from upstairs as the men moved through her home. She was 14 years old, trying to understand why government agents were counting her mother's silverware and photographing her father's paintings. Edith tried to explain. The law required this. They had to cooperate. But it was difficult to make a teenager understand why strangers had the right to inventory everything her family owned. The servants found the whole affair disturbing. These federal agents treated Biltmore like a warehouse, not a home. They moved furniture to measure rooms. They asked intrusive questions about household operations. How much coal was consumed annually? What were the staff wages? How many acres were under cultivation? The butler answered what he could and deflected what he couldn't, but the agents were persistent. They had legal authority, and they used it. After 3 weeks, the assessors compiled their preliminary findings. They wouldn't reveal the final numbers yet. That would come later, in an official report delivered to Edith's lawyers. But the scale of the assessment was becoming clear. Every asset had been examined, every piece of property valued. The total would be substantial, potentially devastating. Edith met with the lead assessor in the library before they departed. She asked directly what the valuation would be. He refused to provide specifics, but indicated that the property was worth significantly more than what her lawyers had estimated. The house alone, he suggested, might be assessed at $2 million or higher. The land at several million more. The contents another million at least. She was looking at a total valuation that could exceed $8 or $9 million. The math was simple and brutal. 10% of $9 million was $900,000. She had $100,000 in liquid assets. Even if she sold timber immediately, even if she liquidated some of the art collection, she couldn't possibly raise $900,000 in cash within the required time frame. She would have to sell land. Massive amounts of land. Tens of thousands of acres. George's vision of a managed forest, a self-sustaining estate, would have to be dismantled to pay the government's bill. The assessors left Biltmore that afternoon, their briefcases filled with photographs and documentation. They would return to Washington, compile their final report, and send the official valuation within a few months. Then Edith would have 1 year to pay. 1 year to find $900,000 or whatever the final number turned out to be. 1 year to decide what to sacrifice to keep what remained. She sat in the library after they departed, surrounded by the 10,000 books they had spent a week counting. The intrusion was over, but the threat had only grown. The federal government had walked through her home, itemized her possessions, and calculated what she owed for the privilege of inheriting what her husband had left her. The assessment wasn't just financial. It felt personal. Like they were telling her she didn't deserve this, that she hadn't earned it, that she should be grateful the government was allowing her to keep anything at all. But anger wouldn't help. The law was the law. The assessors were doing their jobs. The estate tax was constitutional, properly enacted, legally enforceable. What Edith needed now wasn't emotion. It was strategy. Her lawyers would have to challenge the valuation, argue that unique property couldn't be assessed at theoretical market prices, find some legal mechanism to reduce the bill. Because if the final number came in anywhere near $900,000, she was going to lose most of what George had built. The IRS had come to Asheville, and they weren't leaving empty-handed. Chapter 5. The Lawyers Who Fought for Biltmore. Edith hired the best legal team money could buy. Her lead counsel came from a prominent New York firm with experience challenging federal tax assessments. He brought 2 associates with him, both specialists in the brand new field of estate taxation. The field was so new that almost no one had expertise yet. The law had only existed since October of 1913. These attorneys were learning as they went, building strategies that had never been tested in court. The first move was to request a formal hearing with the Bureau of Internal Revenue. The preliminary assessment of $8 to $9 million was unacceptable, they argued. The agents had overvalued nearly everything. Their appraisals assumed market conditions that didn't exist. Their methodology was flawed. They demanded a line-by-line review of every figure, and they got it. The legal strategy had 3 components. First, challenge the appraisal of the house itself. Second, fight the land pricing. Third, dispute the assessment of contents. If they could reduce the total by even 20 or 30%, the tax bill would drop by hundreds of thousands of dollars. That might mean the difference between survival and forced liquidation. The house was the easiest target. The assessors had priced it at over $2 million based on construction costs and materials. The attorneys argued this was absurd. Yes, it had cost that much to build. But what was it actually worth? Who would buy a 250-room chateau in rural North Carolina? There was no market for such a property. Comparable sales didn't exist because comparable properties didn't exist. The fair market price, which is what the tax law required, was far less than construction cost. They brought in architectural experts who testified that unique properties often sold for fractions of their building costs. A custom-built palace designed for one family's specific needs had limited appeal to potential buyers. The experts estimated that if forced to sell, Biltmore House might bring $750,000 to $1 million at most. Less than half what the government claimed. The land presented more complexity. 125,000 acres of virgin timber had obvious worth. Lumber companies would happily purchase it. The assessors had calculated roughly $40 per acre based on timber yields and current lumber prices. That produced a total of $5 million. The legal team attacked this number from multiple angles. First, they contended that selling such a large tract all at once would depress prices. Flooding the market with that much timber would drive down the per-acre amount. The assessment assumed peak prices for every acre, which was economically impossible. Second, much of the acreage was mountainous and difficult to access. Logging costs would be high. The net return per acre was lower than assessors claimed. Third, some portions were designated for conservation and forestry experimentation, reducing commercial potential. The attorneys proposed a revised figure of $3 million instead of $5 million. They maintained that this reflected realistic market conditions rather than theoretical maximums the government resisted. Back-and-forth negotiations continued for months. The Bureau of Internal Revenue had no incentive to accept lower numbers. Every dollar they shaved off meant less tax revenue. They pushed back on every challenge. The contents presented the trickiest problem. How do you dispute a Renoir's worth? If an art appraiser says it's $50,000, and auction records show similar work selling for that price, what's the counterargument? The legal team found one. They contended that the assessment should reflect forced sale prices, not retail amounts. If Edith had to sell artwork quickly to raise cash for taxes, she wouldn't get full market returns. Urgent sales always brought lower prices. The tax should be based on what she could actually receive in her circumstances, not what pieces might bring under ideal conditions. The government rejected this reasoning. The law required assessment at fair market worth, they insisted. Fair market meant what a willing buyer would pay a willing seller, assuming normal conditions. The widow's financial emergency didn't change the underlying worth of the assets. If she chose to sell quickly and accept lower amounts, that was her decision. The tax was based on actual worth, not distressed sale pricing. The legal fees mounted quickly. The attorneys were billing hundreds of dollars per week. Every meeting, every filing, every hearing added to Edith's costs. She was paying lawyers to fight a tax assessment so she could afford to pay the assessment. The circular logic was maddening, but she had no choice. Without legal representation, the government would impose their full figures unchallenged, and the resulting bill would be impossible to pay. By late 1914, negotiations had been ongoing for 6 months. The Bureau of Internal Revenue had reduced their total somewhat down to around $7 million from the initial $8 or $9 million. The legal team maintained this was still too high and continued pressing for further reductions. But the government was digging in. They had political pressure to collect substantial estate taxes from prominent wealthy families. The Vanderbilt case was high profile. Backing down too much would send the wrong message. Edith watched her liquid assets drain away while lawyers debated appraisals. The legal fees alone had consumed tens of thousands of dollars. Meanwhile, Biltmore's operating costs continued, $50,000 per year whether she could afford it or not. Her $100,000 in cash reserves was shrinking faster than anticipated. She would need to start selling assets soon, regardless of what the attorneys achieved. Her lead counsel delivered an update in early 1915. The best outcome they could realistically expect was a total around $6 to $6.5 million that would produce a tax bill of roughly $600,000 to $650,000. Still catastrophic, but somewhat less than the worst-case scenario of $900,000. To achieve even this, they would need to make concessions, accept some of the government's figures, stop fighting certain line items, focus challenges on the areas where they had the strongest positions. The alternative was litigation. They could refuse to settle, force the government to take them to court, and fight the numbers before a judge. But litigation would take years. During that time, the tax bill would remain unpaid, accumulating penalties and interest. And there was no guarantee they would win. The law was new, the precedents unclear. A judge might side with the government and impose the full amount the assessors originally claimed litigation was a gamble Edith couldn't afford. So they settled. In the spring of 1915, roughly 1 year after George's death, the final estate assessment was established at $6.5 million. The tax bill came to $650,000, due immediately. Edith had perhaps $30,000 left in liquid assets after paying legal fees. She needed to raise $620,000 in cash, and she had only one way to do it: sell the land. Massive amounts of acreage. The very thing George had spent decades assembling was about to be dismantled piece by piece until the government's bill was satisfied. The legal team had done what they could. They had reduced the tax bill by potentially $250,000 compared to the worst-case scenario. But they couldn't eliminate it. They couldn't maintain that unique property shouldn't be taxed. They couldn't convince the government to accept token payments. The law was clear. The estate owed 10%. And Edith would have to find a way to pay it, even if doing so destroyed most of what she was fighting to preserve. The lawyers had won a partial victory. It wasn't enough. Chapter 6. The Sacrifice. The sale began in the summer of 1915. Edith's attorneys had identified the most marketable portions of the holdings: the land farthest from the house, the acreage with the densest timber, the parcels that timber companies would purchase immediately. The first negotiations started with local lumber operations interested in immediate harvesting rights. The federal government approached with the largest offer. The United States Forest Service, newly established and looking to expand public lands in the Appalachians, made a proposal for a massive tract, 86,700 acres. The price was $5 per acre, $433,500. The amount was far below what the land was worth based on timber values alone. But Edith needed cash immediately to satisfy the tax bill, and the government knew it. They offered a take-it-or-leave-it deal. She took it. The sale to the Forest Service closed in 1915. 86,700 acres that George had spent years acquiring, land he had planned to manage as a model of sustainable forestry, became Pisgah National Forest. The government got a bargain. Edith got enough cash to pay the majority of her tax obligation. But she lost the vast majority of what George had built. The sale brought $433,500. The tax bill was $650,000. She was still more than 200,000 short. Additional parcels would have to be sold to cover the remaining balance, plus outstanding legal fees, plus operating costs that continued regardless of her financial crisis. More acreage went on the market over the following months. Smaller tracts sold to timber companies and private buyers. Each transaction brought a few $1,000s. Each transaction reduced what remained. The original 125,000 acres shrank dramatically. By the time the tax bill and associated costs were fully paid, Edith had sold the overwhelming majority of George's land holdings. What remained was a fraction of the original vision. Enough acreage to maintain the house, gardens, and immediate grounds. Enough to preserve the appearance of a great estate. but not enough to sustain George's forestry experiments or his dreams of demonstrating that timber could be harvested sustainably while preserving the land for future generations. Gifford Pinchot's careful forest management plans, the first of their kind in America, became largely irrelevant when the forest itself was dismantled and sold. The financial sacrifice was obvious, but the philosophical loss cut deeper. George hadn't built Biltmore just to have a large house. He had wanted to prove that American wealth could be used for more than consumption, that a private landowner could practice conservation, could manage resources responsibly, could demonstrate that profit and preservation weren't incompatible. The estate was supposed to be a working example of enlightened land stewardship. The tax law had turned it into a forced liquidation. Edith understood this. She knew that selling the acreage meant surrendering everything George had cared about beyond the house itself, but she had no alternative. The government demanded payment in cash. The only asset she could convert to cash quickly enough was land. And so it went, piece by piece, until the bill was satisfied. The art collection required attention as well. Some paintings were sold to raise additional funds. The specifics of which pieces went and what they brought varied, but the sales were painful. George had spent decades assembling this collection, choosing each work carefully, building something that rivaled museum holdings. Now, pieces were being sold to cover debts and obligations. The rare book collection suffered similarly. Dealers examined the library, identifying items that could be sold. The most valuable volumes went to auction or private sale. Book by book, the collection was reduced. It remained impressive, but it was no longer one of the finest private libraries in the country. Furniture and decorative items followed. Not the major pieces that defined the rooms, but secondary items that could be removed without devastating the interior. Each sale raised needed funds. Each sale left gaps that reminded everyone what had been lost. By late 1916, 2 years after George's death, Edith had paid every obligation. The tax assessment, the legal fees, the accumulated operating costs. But the estate had been fundamentally transformed. The vast majority of the original acreage was gone. The art collection had been diminished, the library depleted, the furnishings scattered. What remained was still impressive by any standard. But it was a shadow of what George had created. The annual operating costs hadn't changed. Approximately $50,000 to run Biltmore, whether she owned the reduced acreage or the original holdings. The staff still required wages. The house still needed heat. The grounds still demanded maintenance. But now she had far less property generating income. The remaining farms and forests produced some revenue, but nothing like what George had projected when he owned the full tract. Edith calculated that she was trapped. She had paid the immediate crisis, but the long-term arithmetic was unsustainable. Her liquid reserves were essentially depleted. The remaining property generated limited income. Operating costs far exceeded what the estate could produce. She was losing money annually with no way to make up the difference. Eventually, she would have to sell more, or find another solution entirely. This was the legacy of the estate tax. Not just a one-time payment, but a forced liquidation that fundamentally altered what could be preserved. The tax had taken its share in 1915 and 16. Now time and economics would continue the erosion, and Edith would spend the next decade and a half fighting to prevent the complete destruction of everything George had built. She sat in the library, looking out at what remained. George had been dead 2 years. In that time, she had lost the overwhelming majority of his estate just to keep the house and immediate grounds. And she knew, sitting there in 1916, that the battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The question was whether she could find a way to make what remained sustainable, or whether the slow erosion would continue until nothing was left but the house itself and memories of what it once had been. Chapter 7. The Final Settlement. What the Government Took. The last payment cleared in March of 1916, almost exactly 2 years after George's death. The Bureau of Internal Revenue confirmed receipt of $650,000. The estate tax was satisfied. The legal battle was over. Edith Vanderbilt had kept Biltmore House. but the price of keeping it was almost everything else. The accounting was straightforward and devastating. George had assembled 125,000 acres. After the forced sales, only a fraction remained. The house stood intact, along with the immediate grounds and gardens, the conservatory, the farms closest to the main residence, the forest visible from the windows. Everything beyond that was gone. The vast wilderness George had envisioned managing as a model of conservation had been sold to satisfy a federal tax bill. Inside the house, the losses were equally visible to anyone who had known the collection before. The walls still held paintings, but not the masterworks. The library still housed thousands of volumes, but the rarest manuscripts and signed first editions had been auctioned. The rooms still contained French and Italian furniture, but many of the pieces George had purchased directly from European chateaux were gone. What remained was impressive. What was missing was irreplaceable. Edith's immediate financial crisis was resolved, the tax was paid, the legal fees were settled. She wasn't facing imminent foreclosure or seizure, but she wasn't secure either. Her liquid reserves were essentially zero after 2 years of converting everything possible to cash. The estate's annual operating costs held steady around $50,000. The income from what remained was modest. She was running a deficit that would slowly consume whatever value was left. The staff had been trimmed where possible. The house still required substantial maintenance and service, so reductions were limited. But the gardeners who had managed distant property sections were gone. The foresters who had worked with Gifford Pinchot on sustainable timber management were no longer needed because the forest had been sold. These cuts saved some money, but not enough to close the gap between expenses and revenue. Cornelia was 16 years old in 1916. She had watched her mother fight the government for 2 years, had seen their holdings dismantled piece by piece, had learned lessons about wealth that most teenagers never encountered. Money wasn't permanent. Property could be seized. The government could take what it wanted if you didn't have cash to pay them. These weren't abstract principles. They were lived experiences that would shape how she managed her own inheritance. Edith had survived the estate tax, but she hadn't won. The Bureau of Internal Revenue had collected their $650,000. The progressive reformers who designed the tax had achieved exactly what they intended. The Vanderbilt fortune had been reduced. The concentration of wealth had been diminished. The massive private holdings had been broken up with substantial portions transferred to public ownership. From the government's perspective, the system worked perfectly. From Edith's perspective, she had preserved the centerpiece, but lost the context. Biltmore House still stood, magnificent and intact. But it was supposed to be more than just a large residence. George had envisioned a working demonstration of enlightened land management. A forest managed sustainably, while privately owned. A model other wealthy landowners could follow. The house without the surrounding lands was just an expensive structure in the mountains, impressive but incomplete. The question facing her now was simple. Could she maintain what was left on the limited income it generated? The arithmetic suggested no. She could manage the deficit for a few years, perhaps. But eventually she would exhaust her options. More art would have to go. More books would be sold. Maybe portions of the remaining acreage would require liquidation. The slow erosion would continue unless something fundamentally changed. What changed was Edith's approach. She refused to accept inevitable decline. Instead, she managed with ruthless efficiency, spent only when absolutely necessary, and found creative ways to generate additional revenue. Portions of the house were rented for special events. Produce from the farms was sold locally. Timber rights on remaining forest parcels were carefully licensed. Every source of income, no matter how small, helped narrow the gap between what the property cost and what it could generate. For 13 years, from 1916 to 1929, she maintained this precarious balance. The house stayed in excellent condition. The grounds remained beautiful. Cornelia grew up, married, had children. Biltmore functioned as a private residence for one of America's prominent families. But it was always fragile. One major repair, one agricultural setback, one unexpected crisis could tip everything back toward forced sales and liquidation. Then, 1929 arrived. The stock market crashed in October. The Great Depression began. And Edith discovered that surviving the estate tax had only been the first crisis, the second battle, the one that would truly determine whether Biltmore could continue existing as a family home was about to begin. The tax had consumed most of the holdings in 2 years. The Depression would threaten what remained over the next decade. And Edith would have to consider solutions even more radical than selling land and artwork. She would have to think about the unthinkable, opening the doors to complete strangers and charging them admission to walk through her private residence. Chapter 8. The Depression that Forced the Final Surrender. The stock market collapsed on October 24, 1929. Black Thursday. Fortunes evaporated overnight. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Within weeks, the American economy was in free fall. For most people, the Depression meant unemployment and poverty. For Edith Vanderbilt, it meant the complete destruction of what little financial stability she had managed to preserve. She was 55 years old. For 13 years, she had balanced Biltmore's finances through careful management and creative revenue generation. The farms produced income. Timber sales brought cash. She had managed to keep operating costs roughly aligned with what the property could generate. It was precarious, but it was working. The Depression destroyed that balance in months. The farms couldn't sell their produce. Local buyers had no money. Markets for agricultural products collapsed as demand disappeared. What had been a reliable source of a few $1,000s annually became nearly worthless. Crops rotted in fields because transporting them to distant markets cost more than they would bring. Timber values plummeted. Lumber companies stopped buying because construction had ceased. New building ground to a halt as credit dried up and buyers vanished. The forest parcels that Edith had been carefully harvesting to generate income became unsellable. Trees had value only if someone was willing to purchase them. In the early 1930s, no one was. The investments that generated what little passive income she had left failed next. Bonds defaulted. Dividend payments stopped. Banks that held her accounts faced runs, and some collapsed entirely. The modest financial cushion she had rebuilt over 13 years vanished. She was back where she had been in 1916, except now the entire economy was collapsing around her, and no buyers existed for anything she might sell. Property taxes hadn't changed. North Carolina still expected payment regardless of economic conditions. The annual bill came due whether she could pay it or not. Insurance premiums continued. Utility costs persisted. The house required heating through winter, or the pipes would freeze and burst. She could reduce staff, delay maintenance, cut every possible expense, but she couldn't make the basic costs disappear. By early 1930, Edith was facing the same arithmetic that had nearly destroyed her 14 years earlier. Fixed costs that couldn't be eliminated, income approaching zero. Liquid reserves depleted. And this time, there was nothing left to sell. The acreage was gone. The best artwork was gone. The rarest books were gone. She couldn't liquidate her way out of this crisis because there was nothing left to liquidate that would bring enough cash to matter. Her advisors presented the options. Close Biltmore entirely. Dismiss all staff. Board up the windows. Let it sit empty until economic conditions improved. This would eliminate operating costs but guarantee the house would deteriorate. Without heat and maintenance, a structure that size would suffer serious damage within a few years. Closing it might save money in the short term, but destroy it in the long term. The second option was selling the house itself. Someone might purchase it despite the Depression, a hotel company perhaps, or a developer who could convert it to apartments or a resort, but selling meant surrendering George's legacy completely. Everything she had fought for since 1914 would be lost. Her daughter Cornelia would inherit nothing. The Vanderbilt name would be erased from the property. This was unacceptable. The third option came from an unexpected source. Someone suggested opening Biltmore to paying tourists. The idea had been floated before and immediately rejected. Vanderbilts didn't charge admission to their homes. Society families didn't turn their residences into attractions. It was beneath them. Unseemly a public admission that the family had fallen so far, they needed to monetize their own house. But by late 1930, Edith was out of alternatives. The Depression had eliminated every other revenue source. Tourism might actually work. America had tourists despite the economic collapse. People still took vacations, though fewer and cheaper ones. Asheville was already a destination. The idea of touring the largest private home in America might attract visitors even during hard times. If she could generate even modest admission revenue from steady visitors, it might cover basic operating costs. The decision wasn't made quickly or easily. Edith consulted with Cornelia, now 30 years old and married with her own children. Cornelia understood the stakes. If they didn't find a way to generate income, Biltmore would be lost. Opening to tourists was humiliating, but losing the house entirely was worse. They agreed to try. In 1930, Biltmore House opened its doors to paying visitors for the first time. The announcement shocked Newport and New York society. The Vanderbilts, one of America's most prominent families, were charging admission to their home. It was scandalous. Other wealthy families whispered about how far the Vanderbilts had fallen. Some called it disgraceful. A few understood it was survival. The logistics were complex. Which rooms would be open to tours? The first floor, certainly. Perhaps the second floor bedrooms, if they could be secured. The family would need to maintain private space on the third floor. Guides would have to be hired and trained. Security was essential. Insurance had to be adjusted to cover public access. Facilities for visitors needed to be arranged. Parking areas created. The house had to be transformed from a private residence into a functioning tourist attraction while the family still lived there. The first visitors arrived that year. They paid admission at the door. They were guided through the first floor rooms. The entrance hall with its soaring ceiling, the banquet hall where the Vanderbilts had entertained, the library with thousands of remaining books. The winter garden with its palms and orchids. Tours lasted about an hour. Visitors departed through an area where souvenirs and postcards were available. The reaction was mixed. Some visitors were thrilled to see inside America's grandest house. Others felt uncomfortable walking through a home where people still lived. Tour guides had to handle both the admirers who wanted to see everything and the curious who asked intrusive questions about the family's finances. It was awkward, but it worked. Within months, Biltmore was attracting steady visitors. The admission revenue wasn't enormous, but it was consistent. The income added up week by week, month by month. Combined with drastically reduced operating costs, it was enough to keep the house maintained and the essential staff employed. Biltmore survived 1930 and 1931, and every year after that. Edith had done what she swore she would never do. She had opened George's Palace to strangers. She had charged admission to walk through rooms designed for private entertaining. She had turned the monument George built into a business, but she had also saved it. The house that the estate tax had nearly destroyed in 1915 survived the Depression by surrendering its exclusivity. The public saved what private wealth could no longer sustain. Chapter 9. The Woman Who Saved Biltmore by Giving It Away. Opening Biltmore to tourists in 1930 was supposed to be temporary. A desperate measure during desperate times. Edith believed that once the Depression ended, once the economy recovered, she could close the doors again and return to private life. She was wrong. The decision to open the house was irreversible. Once tourists had been admitted, there was no going back. The income from admissions grew steadily through the 1930s. Word spread that America's largest private home was open for tours. Newspapers wrote features. Travel guides included Biltmore in their recommendations. Visitors came from across the country, curious to see how the other half had lived during the Gilded Age. What started as a financial necessity became a successful business. By the mid-30s, Biltmore was attracting thousands of visitors annually. The admission revenue exceeded what Edith had generated from all other sources combined during the 1920s. The farms, the timber sales, the investments, none of them had produced what tourism generated. She had stumbled onto the only sustainable model for maintaining a property of this scale the public would pay to preserve what private wealth could no longer support. Edith continued living at Biltmore while operating it as a tourist attraction. The arrangement was strange but workable. Visitors toured the first and second floors during daytime hours. The family maintained private quarters on the third floor. They used back staircases and service passages to move through the house without encountering tourists. It was like living in a museum. Uncomfortable at times, but preferable to losing the house entirely. Cornelia had married John Francis Amherst Cecil, the younger son of a British aristocrat. They had two sons who would prove essential to Biltmore's future, George and William Cecil. The family lived at the estate alongside Edith, raising the next generation in the house George Vanderbilt had built. The tourist operation required constant management. Staff needed training in how to handle visitors. Rooms needed maintenance to withstand thousands of people walking through them. Annually, security had to prevent theft while remaining unobtrusive. Insurance costs rose with public access. Marketing required investment. The business of running a historic house museum was complex and demanding, but it worked. Through the late 30s and early 40s, Biltmore remained financially stable for the first time since George's death. The Depression gradually eased. World War II brought economic recovery. Tourism continued throughout, with Biltmore becoming an established destination. What Edith had started as a desperate gamble had become a permanent solution. Edith Stuyvesant Dresser. Vanderbilt died at Biltmore on December 21, 1958. She was 85 years old. She had lived 44 years as a widow, longer than her 16 years of marriage to George. She had fought the government, survived forced liquidation of most of the estate, endured the Depression, and ultimately saved Biltmore by surrendering its exclusivity. The house she preserved passed to her daughter. Cornelia inherited Biltmore in 1958, along with the tourist business that sustained it. However, the actual operation of the estate had been managed by her sons, George and William Cecil, who had been deeply involved in the business for years. The two brothers understood what their grandmother had accomplished and what it required to continue. The brothers took full control after Edith's death. They understood that Biltmore couldn't survive as a private residence. It could only survive as a business. They formalized that reality, incorporating the estate as the Biltmore Company, with family members as shareholders and the house itself as the primary asset. The transition from personal ownership to corporate structure was essential for legal and tax reasons. Estate taxes still existed, still threatened large inheritances. By structuring Biltmore as a business rather than a personal residence, the family could justify its value differently. The house wasn't worth what someone would pay to live in it. It was worth what it could generate as a commercial property. That distinction mattered for tax assessments. Under the Cecil brothers' management, Biltmore expanded beyond simple house tours. Additional revenue streams were developed over the following decades. Wine production was eventually added, utilizing the estate's original buildings. The property began hosting events, weddings, corporate functions. Every revenue stream helped support the enormous costs of maintaining a 250-room house. The model Edith had created out of desperation in 1930 became the template for historic house preservation across America. Other estates followed Biltmore's example. The Breakers in Newport, Hearst Castle in California, countless other Gilded Age mansions survived by opening to tourists. The public saved what private families could no longer afford. The houses that had been built to demonstrate wealth and exclusivity survived by becoming democratic. Edith wouldn't have chosen this path if she'd had alternatives. She spent years trying to avoid it. But when forced to choose between surrendering George's legacy completely or sharing it with strangers, she chose sharing. That decision saved Biltmore, not just for her lifetime, but for generations after. The house George built in the 1890s was still standing in the 21st century because his widow had been willing to do what seemed unthinkable. She gave it away to save it. The irony was profound. George had spent $6 million building a private palace in the mountains, away from society, away from crowds, away from the public eye. He wanted seclusion and privacy. He created beauty for himself and his family. Edith preserved that beauty by destroying the privacy. She invited the crowds George had avoided. She commercialized what he had kept exclusive. And by doing so, she ensured his creation would outlive them both by over a century. Chapter 10, Biltmore Today, What Survival Cost and What It Teaches. Biltmore Estate welcomes over 1 million visitors annually. They arrive in tour buses and rental cars, parking in lots that hold thousands of vehicles. They pay admission, collect audio guides, and spend hours exploring 250 rooms that were designed for one family's private use. The house that George Vanderbilt built for $6 million in the 1890s generates tens of millions in revenue annually as a tourist destination. It is one of the most successful historic house museums in America. The Vanderbilt family still owns it. This fact surprises most visitors who assume such properties eventually transfer to government ownership or nonprofit foundations. But Biltmore remains privately held, operated by descendants of George and Edith Vanderbilt through the Biltmore Company. William Cecil's son, also named William, manages the operation today. The family lives elsewhere but maintains control of the property and business. The survival is remarkable because it's so rare. Of the hundreds of Gilded Age mansions built between 1870 and 1920, only a handful remain in family hands. The Vanderbilt family alone built multiple palaces. The massive Fifth Avenue mansion in New York, demolished. The Breakers in Newport, given to a preservation society. Marble House, transferred to preservation. Cornelius Vanderbilt's original New York house, destroyed. George Washington. Vanderbilt's Biltmore is the only major Vanderbilt estate still owned and operated by the family that built it. The reason is simple. Biltmore became a business. The others remained private residences until they became unsustainable, then were surrendered or demolished. Edith's 1930 decision to open the doors transformed the estate from a luxury consumption item into a revenue-generating asset. That transformation made long-term survival possible. The houses that stayed exclusive died. The one that went public lived. The business model has expanded far beyond simple house tours. The winery produces hundreds of thousands of cases annually and accounts for significant revenue. The estate hosts weddings, corporate events, concerts. The grounds feature hotels, restaurants, shops. Visitors can spend entire weekends on the property without exhausting the activities available. It's a resort built around a historic house, with the house itself as the anchor attraction. This commercial success protects Biltmore from the estate tax that nearly destroyed it in 1914. Because the property operates as a business, it's valued differently for tax purposes than a private residence. The estate generates income, employs hundreds of people, functions as a significant economic engine for Asheville and western North Carolina. That commercial reality provides legal and financial justifications that pure private ownership couldn't offer. The business structure that seemed like surrender in 1930 became the legal shield that ensures survival generations later. The broader lesson is uncomfortable but clear. Private wealth, no matter how large, cannot sustain Gilded Age excess indefinitely. The fortunes that built these palaces were enormous by any measure. The Vanderbilts were among the richest families in American history. But even Vanderbilt money couldn't maintain multiple massive estates across generations, once the federal government started taxing wealth transfers. The mathematics became impossible. The estate tax accomplished exactly what its progressive designers intended. It prevented the creation of permanent American aristocracy. The great fortunes of the Gilded Age were broken up through inheritance taxes and forced liquidations. The Astors, the Morgans, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts all saw their concentrated wealth dispersed across multiple heirs and depleted by taxes. Third and fourth generation descendants are comfortable, but not dynastically wealthy. The system worked. But the cost was architectural and cultural. Hundreds of extraordinary buildings were demolished because no one could afford to maintain them. Craftsmen had created masterpieces that lasted decades instead of centuries because the economic model that supported them collapsed. We lost architectural treasures that can never be recreated because the skills, materials, and willingness to spend at that scale no longer exist. Biltmore survived by finding a new economic model. Public access replaced private luxury. Commercial operation replaced personal consumption. The estate that George built for himself now serves millions. That democratization saved the architecture, but destroyed the original purpose. George wanted privacy and seclusion. He got a tourist attraction. The building survived. The dream died. Edith understood this trade-off. She had no choice but to accept it. When faced with complete loss or partial surrender, she chose surrender. That pragmatic decision preserved something rather than losing everything. The house still stands because she was willing to share it. George's architectural vision survives because his widow abandoned his social vision. The story offers a lesson about what we choose to preserve and how we preserve it. Society decided through tax policy that concentrated private wealth was dangerous and should be broken up. That decision destroyed the economic foundation that supported Gilded Age estates. But society also values historic architecture and wants these buildings preserved. Those two goals are in tension. You can't break up concentrated wealth and simultaneously expect private families to maintain palaces that require concentrated wealth to operate. The solution that emerged was democratization. The public pays to preserve what private owners can no longer afford. Historic house museums funded by admission tickets replaced private palaces funded by inherited fortunes. We saved the buildings by changing their purpose. They're no longer homes. They're monuments to an era we simultaneously admire and reject. We want to see how the other half lived, but we don't want that other half to exist anymore. Biltmore embodies this contradiction perfectly. Over 1 million people annually pay to tour a house built by a man who wanted to escape crowds. They photograph rooms designed for intimate family gatherings. They walk through a palace built to demonstrate that one family had more wealth than entire communities. And the reason they can see it is because that family's wealth was destroyed by the same government that now recognizes the house as a national historic landmark. George Vanderbilt built Biltmore to last forever. He used fireproof materials, hired the greatest architects and craftsmen, spared no expense. He succeeded architecturally. The house is structurally sound after 130 years, but he failed economically. The fortune required to maintain such a property as a private residence couldn't survive 20th century tax policy. Edith saved the architecture by surrendering the exclusivity. That was the only option that worked. The estate tax that nearly destroyed Biltmore in 1914 shaped its survival strategy. The depression that forced the doors open in 1930 created the business model that sustains it today. The crises that threatened destruction ultimately forced adaptation. And adaptation, as painful as it was, saved what rigid attachment to the original vision would have lost. Biltmore endures not despite its transformation, but because of it.